Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Gives me
Good
great pleasure to
afternoon.
welcome all of you to yet another Sunday webinar. And this week's topic is transforming fear, the art of living in a scary world. In the interest of full self-disclosure, I consider myself somebody who's very afraid and fearful. So I want to make it clear that I'm not delivering this seminar from the experiential reality of somebody who's transcended, but rather from the compassionate perspective of someone who's struggling, with fear and trying to put together an approach, an understanding, a deeper understanding of fear in all of its myriad manifestations. I'm going to be drawing heavily from a book called Fear by Osho, Understanding and Accepting the Insecurities of Life. The book is on fear. And I would like to begin, in fact, with a beautiful Zen story that he starts with about a man who's walking in the night on a very treacherous terrain down a slope. And he knows that at the end of the slope, there is a precipice. And he's afraid that he would not want to fall into the precipice. But as he's walking down the slope, it becomes completely dark and night has fallen. Suddenly he trips. And when he trips, he clings to whatever he can hold on to instantaneously. And he's holding on to a branch of a tree and hanging from it. He spends the whole night perspiring, anxious, in fear, in terror, because he's concerned that if he lets go of this branch, who knows, he may be close to the edge of the precipice and he might fall into the abyss of nothingness. So he's clinging and clinging, his hands are hurting, it's cold in the night, and he's afraid that his hands might let go at any time and he may plunge into his own death, for he knew there was a precipice there. But gradually the sun rises and he makes it through the night quite miraculously. And when the sun rises, he notices that the ground was barely 6 feet above, under him. So I'm sorry, 6 inches below him. 6 inches. So he's clinging all night thinking he might fall into the precipice, but he discovers, much to his delight, that there was just a 6-inch and he could easily have let go of that branch and rested peacefully. But alas, he had no knowledge of this. And I love the way Osho relates this to how we approach fear. He says, the fear is not more than 6 inches deep. Now it is up to you whether you want to go on clinging to the branch and turn your life into a nightmare, or whether you would love to leave the branch and stand on your feet. There is nothing to fear. And how many of us can relate to this? That we fear the fear itself, and we are clinging to something that we think provides us the comforting illusion of a sense of security. And in that process, we have lost the opportunity to live our life joyously and fully. Osho also talks about 3-dimensional aspects of fear. One, fear is like a shadow in that it is completely insubstantial. But can you imagine, he says, in a dark night in the jungle, you could be afraid of your own shadow, and you see your shadow and you could be so afraid that you could be running from your own shadow. So in many ways, the metaphor of the shadow applies to fear. The fear is also like a rope that you think is a snake. So there might be a low rope lying somewhere and you imagine that it's a snake. Can you see that you'll have all the physiological accompaniments of fear associated with it? Your heart will start palpitations, you'll be sweating because you think you have actually seen a snake, but it's just a rope. And it is as insubstantial as that, but at the same time, the fear is very real, even if it's based on a misperception or an illusion. A third metaphor that he brings up is that of a dream or a nightmare. You could have a nightmare and have all the physical reactions of fear associated with it. Was the nightmare real? It wasn't. But was the fear real? Yes, it was. So one of the things we have to deal with is to bring a tremendous amount of compassion to ourselves and to our fellow human beings, because if we were to really write down the number of things that we are afraid of, there is so much that we are afraid of in life, and so much of what we do in life is actually a response to a sense of insecurity that we possess. So what are some of the fundamental fears? We're going to peel the layer and try to see different ways of trying to look at and understand the fear. So Osho talks about how deep down the fear is, deep inside, that I may not be. So what is that? So if we look within, each one of us is just a space of inner consciousness. We have an inner sky within us. And it almost seems like there is an emptiness within, an emptiness that we begin to fear. We may be full of thoughts and feelings, but there is a fear that somehow we are not worthwhile, that deep down, if I look within, I am nothing. And this fear leads us, each one of us in different ways, to try to be special in some way so we can convince ourselves that we are not just empty. So we might try to embellish our life with degrees, with other symbols of prestige and all of that. But the fear persists because no matter how far we run, trying to hide our fears, trying to run away and prove that we are special, somehow, in one way or the other, we are running away from confronting the beautiful emptiness that we are. Now, we have come to fear emptiness. Notice how afraid we are of an empty social calendar if we have nothing on the calendar. Because in the modern world, we have tended to equate clutter and busyness with a worthwhile life and emptiness with a worthless life. One of the first steps that we have to overcome to redefine our relationship to emptiness in order to be able to transcend fear, to be able to see that the inner sky that we carry is just as beautiful as the outer sky. Are there a lot of objects in the sky? Is that what makes the sky beautiful? Not necessarily. The vastness of the sky itself is beautiful and is a space of possibility. So, enveloped by all these fears, over time, we start accumulating psychological teddy bears. And each one of us has our own psychological teddy bears. We might see little children at airports and railway stations. And now, of course, with all the COVID restrictions, we don't travel, but you see them holding on to teddy bears. But we as adults are holding on to our own emotional and psychological teddy bears. And often our actions are driven out of fear. And we have to remember that we are motivated by fear. The chances are that that seed of fear which is driving us is going to poison and contaminate everything. Think of the times when you started a relationship because you were afraid of being lonely. If your relationship was motivated by fear, can you see how much that relationship will be contaminated by fear? Or if we go to work and we are very afraid of being fired, of losing a job, can you see the extent to which our ability to be creative, to be fully expressive, to achieve self-actualization through our work will be so hampered by the fear? So fear is something that generalizes out of the domain of its origin and tends to contaminate gradually the totality of our lives. One of the biggest fears that Osho discusses in the book Fear is the fear of an unlived life. You know, there is the fear that time is passing and death will soon be here. And what if death comes and I've not been able to live my life fully? What if I have not been able to sing the song that I was meant to sing? You know, and what if I have not lived my life fully? That fear, it can be very crippling. And to quote Osho, if you have enjoyed life, attained to the peaks that life can give you, your life has an orgasmic experience, a deep poetry within you, a song, a festival, a ceremony, and you have lived each moment to its totality, then there's no fear of time, then the fear disappears. So interestingly, the best antidote to fear is to live our life fully, because the sense of regret of an unlived life or a half-lived life is something that never goes away. And sometimes we are afraid of problems and we don't take those chances and risks that will enable us to blossom to the fullness of our potential. But in life, if we try to avoid problems, we are going to create even more of them. So how about we take joy in the fact that life gives us an endless supply of problems, because every problem that life gives us is a challenge to our creativity. And if we can take it on as a game, you know, and think about it in terms of your favorite sport, taking joy in solving those problems and seeing how creative you can be to circumventing them and to transcending them becomes a source of joy. Now, there are two ways to live life, also says Osho. One of them is to swim on the surface of the ocean. So when you swim on the surface of the ocean, you don't go very deep, you go very far. And that is called the horizontal life. In the horizontal life, you have a number of different experiences, but perhaps all of them at a fairly superficial level. And then, just as you can swim on the surface of the ocean, you could also dive deep into the ocean. And that would constitute a different approach to life, of experiencing the depth and intensity. It's just like you could grow by working for 6 different organizations and 6 different jobs and careers, but you could also grow by staying in one place and having a very deep and profound experience of that place. Same thing with relationships. Some people have had many relationships, some people have stayed with a relationship and have celebrated the vertical depth that comes from being deeply and profoundly present. How do we develop this kind of depth of presence? For Osho, it is not something that you can suddenly develop. It is something that you practice day in and day out. You become very conscious and alert of doing ordinary things in life that we do with a great deal of sensitivity and consciousness. For example, you greet somebody and you say hello down the street. Are we just doing that mechanically, or are we doing that with a sense of connection, with a sense of awareness of their presence? If it's a mechanical hello, we are not likely to grow from it. But if we take even a fleeting moment to be fully present to that individual who we may pass on the street, as we look at them peering through the fog of smoke on our lenses and the mask that we are making, but whatever little glimpse we have, if we can be with them fully for that small fraction of a second, there's an experience of contact. The chores that we do, getting up in the morning, brushing our teeth consciously, eating our breakfast consciously, walking consciously, perhaps doing our laundry consciously, folding things consciously. When we start developing a level of consciousness, awareness, and sensitivity, you might not say how it's related to fear, but it is the way in which we start living our life or acquiring the capacity to live our life with greater intensity. And when we live our life with greater intensity, there's a way in which fear keeps evaporating. Because as I said, one of the greatest fears that we as human beings suffer from and labor under the burden of is the fear that we haven't lived our life fully. Now, understanding fear, says Osho, is the key, because very often we don't like to see ourselves as cowards. And in our effort to manage the fear, we repress it. And when you repress the fear, it goes deep into our unconscious mind. And then when fear starts operating from the unconscious mind, it wreaks much more havoc on our lives than the fears that we're consciously aware of. The fears that we're consciously aware of don't hurt us much, but often through layers and layers of unconscious functioning, the fear will have a very indirect effect. And you will not be able to see the way in which it is actually placing us in self-defeating patterns, and perhaps in ways that we are not able to realize our fullest potential. An example of that kind of a fear is fear of intimacy. We all heard that human beings have a fear of intimacy. Why? Because many of us feel inadequate deep within. We feel insufficient. Many of us carry a tremendous amount of shame because we haven't accepted all of ourselves fully. We have desires and thoughts that we are ashamed to share with people, and we are not at peace with ourselves. Intimacy is threatening because we ourselves don't want to look within because we are afraid of what we may find. Can you imagine how much more scary it will be to be able to share that inner reality of ours that we ourselves are trying to hide from with another human being? What if they figure that if they look inside us and then they're able to discover that there is nothing there? What if they discover the emptiness that I carry that I'm so afraid of? Another aspect of fear that we don't often realize is its relationship to desire. So here's the cycle that we often get into. It's almost like a cobweb that we get stuck in. So things happen to us in our childhood that often leave us with a feeling of inferiority or insecurity. We try to compensate for those fears by developing desires and goals which we think will take care of the fear. So, for example, if I fear that I'm not smart enough because somebody made fun of me when I was 9 years old and said Param is stupid. I decide I have to spend the next 25 years earning degrees in order to prove to others and myself that I am smart enough. So notice a sense of inadequacy has now created a great desire, a desire to earn these degrees, to fix myself, and that sense of insecurity. Now, the fear arises because the desire may not be fulfilled. What if I join a master's degree program and I flunk it? So the fear of failure comes up at that time because I may not be able to achieve my desires. But the cosmic existential tragedy of human beings is that it's not just the desires that we don't fulfill that fill us with fear that we may fail. Even if our desires are fulfilled, we become afraid because now a new fear has started, the fear of losing what you have just got. So let's assume I fall in love and I'm desperate for this person that I've fallen in love. I get married. Now a new fear. Firstly, when I fall in love, I may be trembling, thinking the person might reject me. But let's assume the person accepts me. Now I might be afraid that I might get divorced. So I might live with a crippling fear of divorce. And if you live with a crippling fear of divorce, you cannot be really enjoying your marriage. It becomes a plastic marriage because if a fear of divorce is fueling my marriage and my way of being present in it, I'm likely to be so insecure. I'm likely to be so not self-expressed. I'm likely to be hiding, trying to hide myself in the marriage so the other person doesn't get to see me. And the very insecurity is likely to exponentially multiply the possibilities of my being divorced because the other person won't find that relationship fulfilling. This is one of the conundrums of fear, is that in our attempts to manage fear, we go into a shell. And by going into a shell and losing our capacity and resilience, we end up inviting into our lives the very outcomes that we are most afraid of. So that is how our fears become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's almost like we are attracting the very scenarios that we most fear because we are dragging that fear from the past into the present. And the moment it is in the present, the future is born out of the seed of the present, and then the fear just gets perpetuated. So the only way to transcend fear is to accept insecurity itself as a very divine experience. Because when we can accept insecurity as a divine experience, it becomes a beautiful invitation to growth. Another way of looking at fear is to deal with one of the fundamental fears that existential philosophers have talked about, which is the threat of non-being, or to put it simply, the fear of death. And existential philosophers have argued that many of our other fears are disguised fears of this fundamental fear, the fear of non-existing, the fear of death. So the fear of death follows us, and then it takes many different forms: fear of illness, fear of scarcity, and all of that. But one of the ways in which the Eastern mystics like Osho have tried to help reframe death is to remind us that life and death are not separate. They're part of the same. What makes life life is the fact that there's something called death. And what gives death its meaning is the fact that there's something called life. So life and death are like peaks and valleys. They go together. You cannot think of life without thinking of death, and vice versa. In fact, the very day we are born, the possibility of death is also born that same day. So coming to terms with the imminent possibility of death and the dread of dying is one of the fundamental fears that to the existential philosophers has to be transcended. Now, how have the Eastern mystics helped us transcend that fear? They have reminded us that life is like a wave. Remember, I am a wave when I'm alive as an individual. But then when I die, the wave disappears into the ocean, but it is still part of the ocean of cosmic consciousness. So one of the ways in which Eastern mystics like Osho have comforted us and supported us in coping with the tremendous dread, the ontic anxiety of death, is by helping us understand that we arise, each one of us as a human being arises like a wave in the universe. And one day we disappear back into that very universe and we become part of the larger ocean of consciousness. Another framing of fear is that fear is the absence of love. So is fear the root or is it the symptom? Sometimes our fear is a symptom of the absence of love. How? Well, for example, if I don't love people and I feel very unsafe in their presence because I see other human beings as a threat, naturally I'll be very afraid of people. You can see how that would happen. But so the antidote, in a way, that many mystics have suggested, from the tantric tradition, is that the best way to transcend fears is to become more loving, because love is the only antidote to fear. And many of us spend so many years in our relationships wondering, why doesn't the other person love us, and trying to win the love of other people. The true freedom is when you become fully loving. It doesn't matter if the other person loves you. When a human being is in a process of expressing love, experiencing love, and expressing it outward, that very act of expression is a cleansing, is a rejoicing, is a transcending. And nothing melts fear more than love does. Okay, now, time permitting, I'd like to deal with, and one of the beautiful chapters in this book, Fear by Osho, is called Finding a Way to Fearlessness. And there are about 10 or 11 points. I'll try to go through as many of them as time permits. The first way to transcend fear is deprogramming the mind. Easier said than done, right? Because if we look at our fears, you will notice that most of our fears were not our own. We learned them from people. They were taught to us. They were hangovers from the past. My mother was very afraid of cockroaches, and I remain very afraid of cockroaches, sometimes through role modeling. Others, through panoptic gaze, your caregivers worried about you. They were afraid that you would fail. They were afraid that you would go bankrupt. There is no limit to the number of fears that our parents and caregivers may have projected into us. And so what happens is, and our own past experiences, arising out of all these past experiences, our mind comes to be programmed, and it becomes a part of our inner programming. It's almost like tapes in our head that are playing. It's almost like a record that keeps playing. And then how do we deprogram ourselves? The first thing is to be aware of the programming that has happened, to see that many of our fears that we are struggling with have their origins in childhood, in role modeling, in imitating other people, in internalizing some of the fears that our caregivers had. So deprogramming the mind and recognizing it, because our mind, says Osho, has a tremendous capacity to be programmed. Do you see how easily we are all programmed? But it has a tremendous incapacity to deprogram itself. And the way to deprogram itself, one of the pathways is meditation, to be with the inner silence and to watch the thoughts and feelings come by, so that you can see how all these thoughts and feelings are as a result of many of the programming that we have made. Another one is embracing the shame. Many of us will escape from people. We are not comfortable with people. Notice how uncomfortable we become with people. Notice how you are in a room when you're by yourself. Imagine somebody is watching you through the keyhole. Notice how self-conscious and different we become. The mere presence of another human being changes us to a new level of inauthenticity, because we are not comfortable with who we are in our own skin in so many ways. So we are trying to escape from people. We are trying to avoid intimacy because we are worried that we may be carrying something false within us. We have a self-image we like to maintain, and we're very afraid that somebody will peel away the masks and the self-image and see us for the kinds of ugliness that we fear that we carry. In other words, there's a lot of shame. And therefore, we keep our relationships very formal. And we end up living our life as if we are living in a monastery. We keep to ourselves. We don't really disclose the deeper aspects of our life. Notice how superficial most of our relationships are, and notice how when we really start having conversations about the things that matter to us, our fears, our anxieties, our hopes, who we really are, how uncomfortable it makes us and others. But at the same time, if you can take that risk and start creating an ecology of conversations that are truly intimate, rather than going with the social rituals of what's appropriate, if you can challenge yourself to have deep conversations with people. I remember I shared with you about a 2-year experiment that I did where I would start talking to strangers, and after helping them understand that I was not crazy or weird, I would start challenging myself to share stories and aspects about my life that would normally not be shared, that were more authentic and real. And it was amazing how authentic and real other people became in response to my sharing. In other words, we are all suffering from a poverty of real intimacy. We are all suffering from a tremendous cosmic loneliness in the world. And everyone's waiting for somebody else to make the move and share something real, share something genuine, so that then they can also play full out. And often we have so many social gatherings, even with our parents, even with our children, with our loved ones, where we don't take the risks of self-disclosure because of fear. And as a result of that, we remain a stranger to them and they remain a stranger to us. What a tragedy that is. And sometimes we keep ourselves very busy in order to not face our fears. So one of the things that Osho recommends is whatever frightens you, go into it. Because often we avoid the things that frighten us, and he encourages us as a mystic to go into it because fear is the imprisonment. In a way, we are addicted to our fears, and some of our fears are imaginary, but we never test them out. How many of you have heard about the story, and I don't know if it's historically true, that when the French Revolution happened and the prison, is it called the Bastille, that was opened, the gates were opened, many of the prisoners ran out, with their newfound freedom. But within a few hours, by the evening, they just went back and sat in their prison cells because it was comforting. So many of us prefer to avoid our fears, and Osho encourages us to go into it. Go into it, not be stopped by it. Feel your fears deeply and intensely, but experience it, but go into it. Notice, he says, that when there is real danger, our thinking stops. Like, for example, if there's a real poisonous snake on the road that's chasing you, you're not going to be thinking, you're going to be acting. There is something about human beings that when there is a real threat, they stop thinking. So when we are imagining and thinking about fears, you can be almost sure that those fears are often not real. They're imaginary, they're psychological. Like, for example, if I'm thinking about falling sick in my old age and all the pain that I will suffer, that's not a physical fear. The moment I start imagining my physical fears, that physical fear has now become a psychological fear. So what we are dealing with mostly are psychological fears. Many of them are imaginary. And notice, as Osho, that most of our fears are rooted either in the past or the future. They're never in the present. So one of the antidotes to fear is not to be lost in the future with all our imaginary fears, not to be lost in the past, but to be fully present and to be in touch with our fears. He says, beware of the extremes. One extreme is repressing the fear, trying to suppress it and trying to pretend that I'm brave and courageous, like the school bully, who's very afraid inside, but he puts on a big front, a strong front, bosses everybody around, and tries to create an aura or appearance of great bravery. And we do the equivalent of that sometimes through the masks that we wear. But deep underneath there is fear. It has not gone away anywhere, and it's become unconscious. The other option is that we are so afraid and so in touch with our fears that we become completely paralyzed by fear. And between these two extremes, we are lost, either the repression of fear or the paralysis by experiencing the fear. Osho talks about a third way, which is accepting fear as a natural phenomenon. To become soft and tender, to feel the fear, but not be stopped by it. So feel the fear, but not be stopped by it. Don't try to anesthetize yourself from the fear because then you will suppress it. Don't be completely enveloped in the fear and drown in the fear, but to really be able to experience it. Now, also, sadness, anger, fear, these are emotions, and Osho challenges us to accept and embrace all the emotions and make up a beautiful orchestra. In his words, all the emotions make up a beautiful orchestra. If every one of those is in a proportionate way, fear has its own place. Drop the idea of dropping fear. So don't try to drop the fear, drop that idea, because otherwise you create a second layer of problem, where, for example, to be fear is full is one thing, but if I say this fear shouldn't be, I should not be afraid, I start trying to manage the fear. And in that, I've created a secondary reaction where I'm afraid of the fear. I'm fearing the fear. And instead of that, to be able to accept the fear and to understand that anger, fear, sadness, all these emotions that we are afraid of actually make up the music of emotions. It's like a beautiful orchestra. Let them all play in a proportionate way. The only security possible is to start enjoying our insecurity. Just like if you start enjoying your failures, and I tried an experiment, I started celebrating all the times when somebody was able to prove that I was wrong about something, and my life became truly joyous. And my fear went away. Otherwise, I would always be concerned about being contradicted. What if I'm wrong about something? But when I started rejoicing about being wrong about things, now there was nothing to fear. Similarly, if we can start enjoying our insecurity, and remember the TED talk we talked about, which is called Make Stress Your Friend, the research with 8,000 adults that showed that people who embraced stress as a friend and did not consider stress to be bad, the stress actually did not hurt them physiologically. The worst effect on stress was those people who considered stress to be bad. In other words, the research found that it's our attitude to stress that creates the problem. It's not the stress itself. How about we extrapolate the same principle to fear? It's not fear that causes the problem. It's the idea that fear is bad and then creating new levels of fear. If we can say this fear is good, it means I'm at a gate. Osho says usually you experience fear when you're at the threshold of a new stage in your life, a new opening, a new breakthrough, a new flowering. You're at the entrance of a gate where you're leaving the known part and you're entering the unknown. Fear is the sign of a human being who's stepping into the unknown. And if you can celebrate ambiguity as a source of possibility, and we can start dancing with ambiguity and uncertainty, all of a sudden there is a tremendous transcendence of the fear. So, to conclude this presentation, joy, Osho says, is the real antidote. Be conscious but not cautious. Cautious, you become a freight train, he says, shuttling back and forth. Just a freight train, shuttling back and forth. Instead, he says, life consists of very small things. Often, we are waiting for big things to happen. But really, to understand that life consists of small things, a little walk in the park, a cup of tea with your friend, listening to your favorite music, right? Petting your cat or walking your dog. Life consists of small things. And if we can connect with a deep enthusiasm for these small things, so we are not seeing these small things as ordinary, but recognizing that a great life is one where you bring a consciousness, an awareness, an elegance, and a dance to the little things we do in life. When you recognize that every little exchange with a stranger is an opportunity to have a creative conversation, to push the envelope a little, to help people reconnect with the joy of life, when we begin to become enthusiastic about small things without waiting for big things, a joy arises. And that celebration of life is the ultimate antidote to fear. Remember how we've always talked about the Eastern metaphor, and perhaps also in the West, that you cannot fight darkness. You have to light a candle. Similarly, don't try to fight fear, accept it. Understand that fear sometimes has a useful function to perform. Respect it, but also transcend it with joy, right? So by lighting a candle, the darkness disappears, right? And by lighting many small candles, a whole room can be illuminated. By many ordinary acts, very small acts, an explosion of joy happens. And in that, love, joy, these are the emotions that are the sustainable vaccine to fear. With that, folks, I want to bring down the curtain on this webinar. For those of us who are joining for the first time, I want to explain how this goes. At about 2:30 or 2:35, I end my presentation, and it's an opportunity for people who need to leave to actually do that. But for those who wish to stay and continue with the discussion, we stay for another, based on the energy of the group, anywhere from 10 to 30 minutes, and at any point people feel they have other engagements and things to attend to. Today is Super Bowl day, so you can feel free to leave, no pressure to stay. So I want to thank each one of you. If I'm not on your mailing list and you would like to have me on your mailing list, please do text me your email at 216-374-7413, 216-374-7413. I will be happy to put you on the mailing list. Please subscribe to my YouTube channels. Every week, in a few days, I post the preceding presentation to my YouTube channel. Please share this with your friends and colleagues at work. And also, I want to offer, if you have a group at work that might be willing to have me come and share some of these ideas on any topic that's important to you, because I know that even in COVID times, each of us has got workplaces and work groups where we're dealing with challenges. If you can get me an invitation to do a brown bag and to share, I would be very delighted and I would be honored to speak. Thank you so much. And if you have comments or observations, please feel free to turn on your microphone. This is the time and I have to stop speaking. I'm grateful.
Hey, Param, this is Biman. So no comments. It's just a request I am extending to you right now. I am associated with the Employee Resource Group at Rockwell Automation. In fact, I was the president for the Rockwell Automation Asia Pacific for the last 4 years. So this is my